Hello, Jordan.
Hello, Rob.
How are you doing? What's going on?
I'm doing well. I'm just hanging out. How are you?
Same. Livin.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. That's my new mantra. It's freezing. It's so cold today. I don't know if it's cold down in DC.
No,
it's just
it's
miserable
the
today.
It's like 80 degrees here.
Really?
It is unbearable because the complex that I'm in doesn't switch from heat to AC until typically April, May.
Okay. It's by
So
date.
the heat
It's
is
not by
still
temperature.
on. Yeah. It's by average temperature over the span of like a week or two. And it's supposed to snow here Sunday. So we have an 80-degree day today with the heat on in the complex, so it's just making everything really unbearable.
In the swamp.
And then we're getting snow in 72 hours. Yeah, it's
cool.
It sucks.
That sounds pretty like normal weather, normal stuff that we have to live with now. Good.
Yeah, it's
That's fun.
alarming. I don't know. But you know what I have been watching?
What's that?
Is the footage from Trump, also juxtaposed with the footage from Pete from East Palestine.
Yes.
And Trump going to McDonald's in East Palestine, offering
He's
to
in his
buy everyone
element.
McDonald's. It's exactly, that's all I can think. He's back. Like, this is prime Trump. Like, his announcement speech, as we talked about, was so low energy. He was thriving. You put that guy in a McDonald's, he's going to perform.
Yeah, and the workers, they were all loving it. They were hanging on every word. He's riffing with them. He's talking with the owner. You know, he was absolutely in rare form. And we talked a little bit about this on our previous bonus episode with the John Russell of The Holler. And we talked about this kind of phenomenon and the way that it goes beyond incompetence from the Democrats. The fact that, you know, they spent so long before they even mentioned that this incident was unfolding. And they let Trump show up in East Palestine, give this big speech talking about how they'd been abandoned by the federal government, although that they were coming now that he was there, contrasting with Joe Biden hanging out with Zelensky in Ukraine and promising more aid to Ukraine while not really showing up there. And just how completely incompetent they were to allow that to kind of happen and allow him to walk in there and kind of act like a hero, despite the fact that we know that Donald Trump or the conservative movement, they're not going to be strengthening unions, railway unions. They're not going to be coming down hard on these like oligarchic railroad interests. But people around the country, especially in that community, are going to remember that Trump was there trying to support the community. Then, of course, the next day, that's when Pete Buttigieg finally shows up and he puts on his little hard hat and his reflective vest and everything. And he's trying to now act like he's this big, responsible transportation secretary. And it's unbelievably frustrating how completely inept and foolish they look and how they've taken this situation, which they could have, like we outlined in the previous episode, turned it into a big win, come down hard on Norfolk Southern for this, show the community that they're there. And they just look like they only cared because Trump showed up. All they have is really platitudes and, you know, passing the buck and trying to say simultaneously that they're doing a great job, but also that the problem is everyone else's fault. It's just unbelievable how badly they've kind of messed this up and completely blown whatever opportunity there was to draw a contrast between them and Trump and the conservative movement.
Yeah. Just from an optics perspective, you run the country right now. It is your administration. It is your government. Yeah, he's running for president, so he's going to be more opportunistic. You don't let him beat you there. It took Pete 10 days to even acknowledge it, and their defense over the past few days for the delay has been ridiculous. I don't know if you saw it today. There was a reporter from the Washington Post who pointed out that Pete's camp is blaming the head of the EPA and shifting blame onto other departments, which is just like, you still control the railroads. You regulate the railroads. You have some responsibility. It's not just a chemical problem. It's also a rail problem. And that response, letting Trump beat any high-profile government Democrat right now is ridiculous. You have all the resources in the world at your disposal. How do you not get there 5 days later? I mean, Trump shows up two weeks later and he still beats you. It's just a purely optics thing. And that, I mean, we live in a visual heavy media ecosystem. That's what people saw first. And then you get Pete there today and he looks, definitely out of his element. It reminded me a lot of when Kushner went to the Middle East.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
But a little flak vest and everything.
Yeah, with a tiny little flak vest. Pete showed up in a suit and put like a hard hat on. And it's just, dude, come on.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just, it's all just very, it's just,
yeah, it was pretty bad.
Demoralizing.
Yeah. And he's now trying to make this point that like, oh, Trump's here, but do you know that he rolled back these rail regulations, the Obama era rail regulations, which, as we talked about in the previous episode with John Russell, aren't necessarily the cause of this specific crash, but it's a fair point that Trump did indeed roll back these kind of regulations. But at the same time, they've been in charge for 2 years. Like what were they waiting for? They were waiting to get around to that any moment, but right before people started getting mad at them that they were going to reinstitute those. They literally just broke a railroad worker strike like a few months ago, right before this started, where among other things, railroad workers were asking for safer working conditions. And now they're showing up the day after Trump shows up and trying to suggest that it's his fault and that they had nothing to do with it. And it's just, I imagine it rings really hollow for the people in the community. Optically, it's really bad. And I think people around the country are going to kind of remember that response. It's been a incredible lesson in mismanaging something that I think they could have turned into a win for them, and they could have actually done the right thing, came down hard, reinstituted some tougher regulations, protected this community, and now they just look like absolute losers. So congratulations to them.
Yeah. One other element that I thought is really important in this discussion that we talked about with John Russell was this precision scheduled railroading, and the way they strain rail staff, stretch them way too thin, don't staff trains to a sufficient level that would allow them to inspect these trains to prevent against any future disasters in a reasonable way. So that's a great conversation that we had earlier this week, and subscribers can get it by going to theinsurgents.substack.com. For just $5 a month, you get access to that episode and all of our other premium episodes. You become a paid intern. We're greatly appreciative of everybody who has subscribed so far. You help keep the show going, so thank you so much to all of you. Theinsurgents.substack.com. Please consider subscribing.
Yeah. Get access to our episode with John Russell from last week. That was really great, as well as a number of other really fantastic bonus episodes. Become a paid intern. And we actually have a really great episode coming up as well right now with Erik Sperling from the Just Foreign Policy group. Is that a think tank?
Yeah.
How would you describe that?
A nonprofit, anti-war nonprofit.
Really great discussion with him about, how the Russia-Ukraine conflict is progressing, about how there does seem to be a little bit more of an appetite in Washington now for de-escalation and negotiation, which I think is a nice change from how the climate that has been kind of pervasive in Washington and in Ottawa and around the Western world that has supported this conflict, as well as talking about the vacuum that has been left by, I think, the refusal to sort of talk about having de-escalation and talk about the sources of this conflict, which has opened the door to these kind of cynical right-wing types to start taking this anti-interventionist position, including these kind of weird LaRoucheite cultists who we saw had that kind of libertarian anti-war rally over the weekend. We talked about that. Really good discussion. I mean, I am always happy to talk about foreign policy stuff, and the anti-war movement is kind of what got me into, progressive politics in the first place years and years ago. So I really enjoyed this one, talking to Erik. It was really excellent.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I really appreciate his perspective on our foreign policy and international affairs. Just Foreign Policy is a great voice in these conversations, and a much needed one in Washington. They're not the pseudo progressive or pseudo anti-war group that ultimately just picks a side with whatever their partisan ties are. This is a real independent anti-war group. They're fantastic. So stay tuned for that conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yep. And let's get to that.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. Erik Sperling is going to be joining the program right after this. got anything to small talk about? Are you an NBA guy, Eric? Any basketball takes?
Well, you are a basketball guy.
Big NBA
Nice.
guy. Big
There we
NBA
go.
Guy. Yeah, we suffered through. I mean, you know what? We had 50 years of no Bucks championship. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin originally. And we finally got one. And, that's enough. My dad and I actually got to go to one of the finals games. And now we'll always have that. I guarantee on his deathbed, we will be like, we have that. Go Wisconsin.
Yeah.
That's so sick.
Yeah, we're pretty big into it.
Nice. Yeah, I'm a Toronto Raptors guy, so I got the same thing. I got many years of suffering, many years of ineptitude, lackluster seasons, middle of the pack finishes where you have no playoff positioning and you don't have draft positioning. And we finally got one. And I feel like I'm still holding on to it. This Raptors season has been pretty ugly, pretty unfortunate. And I'm still just kind of like, what? It happens. It's all right. Get him next year. No big deal. Just washes right off my back.
Yeah,
now.
I mean, I wasn't the biggest Drake fan in the world, but after that one, what was it, like Eastern Conference Finals where Drake was all over the court? I don't think I could not if a Drake song came on the radio, it would ruin my day.
Yeah.
I mean, it was,
No, I know. It's good that the Bucks got one because otherwise we would be blood enemies because of that kind of stuff. So
yeah, exactly.
now we can we can be friends. So it's all right.
Sure.
As a Cavs fan, same thing. Even with LeBron, it was still a ton of losses, except for 1 year we finally got a title. And I was also on the team.
Helped.
So, but in the way they won that too, coming back from 3-1 was spectacular. And then when after they won, the Cavs cut up the court and put it in this kind of, I don't know if it was like plexiglass or what, but these clear cubes, you can get a piece of the court, and they sold little pieces of the court, and you bet your ass I bought one.
Nice.
I've still got it.
Nice. Yeah. That Raptors championship was nice. It was like really right before the entire world just went down the toilet. So it was like one of the last good things to happen.
Yeah, NBA is the best league. When we deal with some dark stuff, the starvation, genocides, going on in the world, and the wars in Yemen and the nuclear. We need a little bit just to watch some dudes, throw and bounce a ball, and we love it. I didn't realize we're all. Yeah, it's good stuff. And East Coast guys, that's good to see too.
Yeah, Eastern Conference supremacy.
Yeah.
Did you see that clip of it was a group of guys in the West? I can't remember who the reporter was, but she asked them all, like, are you good? Are you okay? Are you happy in the West? And like everyone but Luka raised their hand. He just gets no help. And even with, Kyrie's there now, that's a little bit of a help, but man, he really must hate it in Dallas.
The Western Conference playoffs are going to be a bloodbath.
Yeah. Yeah. Russell Wilson going to the Clippers is going to be a funny development.
Russell Westbrook?
I don't know how that team's going to work.
That was the quarterback, the football quarterback.
What'd I say?
Russell Wilson.
Russell Wilson? I mean, him going.
I'm calling
he
you
would
a
have
fake
as good of a season
fan.
on the Clippers as he did at the Broncos. They're all the same. They're all the Russells are the same. Yeah, sorry, Russell Westbrook. I just don't see how that team's going to work with him there. He's a headache. He's a headache to deal with.
Yeah, I don't know. It's going to be fun to watch. The drama is going to be enjoyable.
Yeah. Anyway, Erik Sperling.
That concludes the small talk
executive director of
segment.
Just Foreign Policy. Yeah, we're moving on. Erik Sperling, executive director of Just Foreign Policy, is joining us today. But before we get into our conversation with you, Erik, we have to ask you a tough question because we ask everybody. We've asked everyone, and now it's your turn. Erik Sperling, are you a gamer?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad I get to say this. One time it pays off. I actually became a gamer of sorts during the pandemic. So it's a new addiction.
Oh.
It's really, really healthy stuff. If I ever look at the hours that I've played, it's like a nightmare. Like whatever, if I can just avoid that screen where it shows me how many hours I've played the game, but it's good. I mean, I got, I don't know if these count as gamer games, but Streets of Rage 4, does that one count on the Switch?
Yeah, of course.
These French guys did this beautiful drawing. It's impressive. There's a whole video. It's like these French people have this quality of life where they can really get into it. It's amazing. And so they have this beautiful game. I think I'm with another one of our lefty friends. I feel like I'm in the top 100. I feel like I'm in the top 500 in the world at that game.
Nice. So that's your main game is Streets of Rage 4.
Yeah. What else did I knock out?
Well, the French have time to work, to put time and effort into those kind of things, because when someone tries to raise the retirement age or take away their vacation time, they burn the whole country to the ground. So it frees them. It frees them emotionally to be able to put time into these things if they need to.
This is what I explained to my wife. I said, this is a work of art. I mean, look at this game, the whole thing's. And I did get into the Turtles game, the recent Turtles game.
They're supposed to re-release like the classic arcade Turtles game, aren't they?
Yeah, I bought that pack too. I mean, I get, late at night, you're stressed, you're just like, let me just buy. I mean, it's all new to me. My mom said no video games, so I finally developed it later. But what I'm really waiting for is Skate 4. And I'm going to buy the PS5 to get the new Skate game, because that's something we've all been waiting on for a minute.
Yeah, that's highly anticipated. So many people I still see on Steam are playing Skate 3. So yeah, 4 is long overdue. I just saw an interview with Tony Hawk yesterday. It was a clip from a while ago, but someone asked him how much money he made off of the Tony Hawk games, and he kind of just broadly summarized, but he said at one point, as they were going to re-release some of the classic, like the original ones, when they were well into the franchise, it was doing so well that Activision had like re-released it and mass produced even more copies, that he was getting checks for like $9-10 million just from those games alone on royalties, which is insane. He said like he's made more money on that game than he has through his skate career, which is just wild.
Yeah, I saw that, and then I also thought of it again because I saw he did some ridiculous ad for some supplement or something like that. Did y'all see this new supplement ad that he has? And I thought, hey, I thought he made so much off the game. I'm like, why does he have to do this supplement thing? It's like I don't even know what it is, but I was like, did he blow all that money? I'm like so confused why he has to stoop to the supplement like ads for like whatever demographic that's for.
What was it, like joint health or?
It might have been. I feel like it probably was.
No. Are we going to have to cancel Tony Hawk? His days are numbered. I'm calling it now.
he keeps it pretty sterile. Yeah. He doesn't express an opinion like on anything. He's very, very savvy.
Yeah, he's a smooth
It's like
operator.
the Michael Jordan school of public relations.
Yeah,
just basically keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. But Eric, in addition to gaming, you're here to talk about something almost as important. That's U.S. foreign policy. And, as the executive director of Just Foreign Policy, you're in the trenches day to day within the machine, within the worst of the worst in Washington. You see it up close. I'm sure it drives you nuts. But one of the hot, foreign policy issues over the past year, we're now just past the year anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'm curious where you think that is heading and how it has been handled over the past year. It's a broad prompt for just kind of your general thoughts on where we're at with that conflict.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say, obviously, to try to think of where to narrow it down. I mean, I think folks probably, I'm assuming a lot of your viewers are in the, they're not big fans of the violence. I'm assuming they're even more concerned about the nuclear violence. So, I think that remains a pretty serious concern. We saw Putin dropped out of a suspended New START, which already was basically not being adhered to. And the whole U.S., kind of class here in D.C. said, well, why would you, how can he do that? So irresponsible. It's like when you're the second closest you've been to nuclear conflict, according to President Biden in world history, you probably don't want the U.S. to come inspect your nuclear facilities. Like when they're basically kind of trying to get a sense of whether, like how they could fare in a nuclear war, you probably don't want them coming in. So it's been an interesting dynamic to see people in D.C. Be so surprised that, when you're kind of supporting a military action, even if it's by other people on Russia's border, that the space for nuclear cooperation goes down. So, and the worst part about being in D.C. is, you really have skin in the game. I mean, I've been talking with staffers, many staffers, and they seem really tough. I say, wow, I thought you were kind of a wonky policy nerd, but you really seem like you're ready to go up in a fireball. I'm really impressed with, I'm not. I'm in full disclosure. I'm more on the nuclear risk averse side.
Controversial.
So I do give them, but I tell them I'm impressed. I really am. But all that to say is I do think what we've seen in terms of the fighting is we've seen, over time, escalating weapons that are being sent, better and better weapon systems that Biden initially ruled out. At the same time, we are still seeing for now the front lines being pretty stable over the last many months. So I think there is potential that, if Ukraine doesn't basically score some major advance and Russia doesn't score some major advance, that you could see the two parties start to exhaust themselves and start to move towards talks. And I think that's the hope. In D.C., you have an entire extremely hawkish faction that's doing a lot of work to promote the idea of sending in fighter jets and the ATACMS missiles they love to talk about. There's a lot to say about that. But so far, Biden, with support from Sullivan and others, have really pushed back on that. And so I think there's a chance that we see a stabilization of the front line and a move towards negotiation. But there's also a chance that, there's some sort of surprise event that maybe leads to a massive Ukrainian advance. Suddenly, Russia feels very threatened, and then we're on the brink of a potential nuclear incident. So that's more or less, I'd say, where the state of play at the moment.
I mean, it's good to hear that Biden is pushing back on that kind of hawkishness. I think one of the consistent, frustrating things for me that I've tried to articulate on this show and elsewhere just over the last year, just how little room in the discourse there's been for anything beyond more arms transfers, more funding, more training to these militias, more escalation, and any kind of idea of having a negotiation or any kind of settlement or talks at all is framed as this kind of like capitulation, or worse, even being like some kind of like Putinist apologia or whatever. It's been really frustrating. And you've seen even like the mild attempts on the part of some kind of progressives in the U.S. government to try and inject a little bit of sanity into that they've get treated like with total hostility by these kind of very hawkish factions, including a lot of people online who will never step foot in Ukraine, but are just articulating this nonstop idea that all that can ever happen in this conflict is more and more escalation and turn it into more and more of a quagmire. Has that been like, from someone that works in that field and is part of that sort of milieu, has that been frustrating for you to see that kind of discourse continue to play out over the last year?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of folks, on the progressive left who follow foreign policy, or even if you just watch Morning Joe, people saw what we now call Diplomacy Gate, which was where, 30 members of Congress said, Biden, we support you. You just a little bit more, little more diplomacy, if that's okay. And there was this massive freak out that kind of became one of the all-time great examples of, accusing someone of, being treasonous for promoting diplomacy. But the good news is, and it was a pretty amusing and kind of traumatic incident for a lot of people. But the good news is that we've had a total shift since then. General Milley is way to the left of where the Progressive Caucus letter was as far as his position. You have even Adam Smith, who was the chair of Armed Services, big recipient of money. He's up in Seattle area with all the defense contractor donors. He said just last week in Munich that Ukraine's not going to militarily retake Crimea, which was way to the left and way bolder than what the Progressive Caucus letter said. And so, and what that means is that means he believes that Ukraine's going to have to give up territory, which is going to be a result of a negotiated, settlement. So, I do think we're inching towards, some sanity. And you definitely have seen that through, with a number of different members. But yeah, it's been really sad, especially for the Ukrainians, because, there was no deal before this war. Like Putin, kind of laid out some outlines of what he would want. He didn't say, how about I'll kill 100,000 people and we'll cut your economy size in half and have like a 10 million person refugee crisis. And in exchange, you also won't get into NATO. And, the result of what's happened is so much more heartbreaking and devastating than even the worst deal that Putin was probably able to accept before the war. So it's just very tragic and unnecessary why, we had to see Ukraine, which who knows how many years or decades it'll take for it to recover, from this.
And when the progressives put forward this letter, you and I talked a little bit on the phone about the consequences of delaying any sort of push for diplomacy. Because even in the grand scheme of things, like you just laid out, it's horrific. Even just a several month prolongment is bad. Could you talk about how you felt and what you hope people understand about how bad it was that people browbeat the progressives into submission when they released the letter calling for diplomacy? It was extremely tame. It was just, hey, this is just something we should consider. That's it. That's all it said. So how did you feel when you saw them walk that back?
Well, to be clear, a lot of members didn't fully walk it back. We had Ro Khanna went out, defended it. AOC shortly thereafter defended it. And, it was sort of just a way to kind of get it out, try to get it out of the news cycle. But I think these are views that withdrawing a letter or not, they don't go anywhere. These are pro-diplomacy views, and a lot of these progressive members are still having those. But, it was kind of an interesting dynamic because the letter was so mild that when these extreme hawkish Twitter people came out attacking it, they actually, when it was so over the top that they could attack that it spurred, just within a couple weeks, we saw people like administration officials coming out, General Milley and others coming out defending it, because it was such a moderate letter that attacking it in that harsh way forced the administration to kind of come out and defend moderate, reasonable negotiation principles. So in that sense, it was almost it hurt progressives briefly, but it really hurt the hawkish Ukrainian cause because it forced a real discussion of diplomacy that even forced a lot of administration officials who are on that kind of leaning that direction to come out. So I think that part is good, I think, but, it was a kind of a strange moment, but I think in the end, it served its purpose of kind of getting that debate going and jumping it forward. And now we're seeing what senior administration officials just leaked to the Washington Post, that they said Ukraine should give it a go for a couple months, see if you can get some more territory in the next few months, and then go to the negotiating table. And that's what senior administration officials are leaking to the Washington Post now. And so we have a chance for this thing to be in talks, before the end of the year, which would be great on many, many fronts.
I'm curious how you reconcile those comments with what Zelensky and Biden are saying publicly this week. Right. So Zelensky saying the Ukrainians are going to win this war, and Biden is saying this will never be a victory for Russia. And I think, there probably won't be a clear-cut winner and loser. It doesn't seem like that's been the case in decades, right? I'm curious how you on the one hand acknowledge and maybe lift up these comments from Biden officials with what they're saying publicly. What should people latch onto?
Yeah, well, it's and I don't want to give away too much here because I think there is a split. We do have in the executive branch. We don't have the type of government where people say, well, the president, he's elected. Let's just do whatever he instructs us to do. If you live in D.C., you get to know that there are people who really consider themselves to be a power center onto themselves, and they are going to advocate for their own interests. So I do, that is really what is kind of the least certain part of it, is that there are, especially people like Victoria Nuland at State, and even Blinken, they've been on the hawkish side of this debate for most of the, for many years, actually. That debate got smaller, when the war began, but now it's kind of reemerging. And I think, what Biden and them, what they want is they don't want it to appear that they pressured Ukraine into a solution. If they do that, then you could have a risk that there's some of the more far right nationalist forces in Ukraine start accusing Biden of being basically betraying them, which could put Zelensky in a very weak position and create additional pressure for Biden to strengthen. So I think to really pump in aid. So I think what they're trying to do is set reasonable amounts of aid and then let the Ukrainians come to their own senses about, how many more lives do we want to throw into this over control of this town or that town. And that's what's so heartbreaking. Speaking of gaming, I was always joking that, if you had a friend in this war, can you imagine if you would say, yeah, go out there, fight for this piece of this village, you would say, stay in your house, play video games all day. Like there's nothing, like do not give your life over this village that could change hands again, but that's really what we're down to. And so you hope that at some point Ukrainians, and there's some evidence, there's some fatigue, will say, you know what, my life isn't worth it. And I always say it's really a debate over land, versus lives. Do I want to give my life to protect this land, or am I willing to negotiate on land to protect the lives? And, I'm more of a lives kind of guy myself. We haven't found a way to bring the lives back. You can't land, stays there, which is the upside of it.
Yeah. I think that's been one of the really weird things, is seeing people in the West who have nothing to do with Ukraine get so reactionary about this and have this adamant attitude that, like, no, these village cannot fall to Russian hands, and we must continue to just throw Ukrainians at this thing until the horde can be repelled. It's very strange. I'm wondering if maybe, despite some of these more hardcore elements in the sort of the cable news set that has been really adamant about not ever surrendering or not ever having any kind of negotiations, do you think one of the reasons that the administration is starting to maybe lean a little bit further in that direction is that there is kind of a fatigue setting in for average Americans who are struggling themselves and who are kind of seeing this nonstop flow of aid to Ukraine and being asked to support the government, just like this, giving this like kind of endless supply of arms and aid while they themselves are struggling? Like, I know I do think the war is becoming a little bit more unpopular after the initial sort of propaganda push kind of subsided a little bit. Do you think that fatigue is having anything to do with the fact that the administration is maybe softening a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think they know. I mean, Biden, I think, still is hoping and dreaming that he could get, a second term. And, with the global economy in the situation it's in, and Republicans controlling the House, you can't pass stimulus, which you learn from Bernie. We learned a little bit of left populism, but when you lose the House, you can't pass that stimulus to help your. And so I think, they have a real interest, and there was a nice New York Times piece hinting at this, that they want to resolve. I think there are elements within the Biden administration that want to resolve this so the global economy can be recovering and roaring going into 2024 in any case. But, I think it's a huge risk if you don't do that. And it's something that I've thought a lot of folks have overlooked, which is, you're basically setting up the far right to score incredibly huge political points on this. And it's very risky if you don't end it, because if Donald Trump, let's say if he says, if he runs, let's say he wins, and the polls out today look scary, good for him, I guess. And then he ends the sanctions on Russia, and immediately cost of living drops. I mean, that could help the far right really win over a huge segment of the working class. And that's, I think, a risk that we can't, that's just too much to take.
Well, you're seeing him in East Palestine right now, coming through, hanging out with McDonald's workers and buying meals for people and shooting the shit with the average people in the community. And then he's saying, where's Joe Biden? He's in Ukraine with Zelensky, handing over more billions of dollars in aid. And like I've been saying on the show, I mean, I think no matter what your personal feelings are about the conflict or Russia and Ukraine or how that's gone, that's going to be a pretty compelling argument for a lot of people. And it doesn't really look really great for Joe Biden or anyone when they seem like they're more concerned with that and coming out on top there than actually like dealing with major crises that are happening and affecting communities of people in America.
Yeah, well, Eric, what are the consequences of that? So we've talked before about ceding ground to the right and these kind of hollow populists on the right on foreign policy. You have Tucker Carlson pretending to be opposed to intervention now for years. They see this as an opportunity, clearly, despite years or decades for some of them on the record being war hawks. They see this as a political opportunity, and the support for this effort, like you're talking about these couch warriors who are tweeting all of these grandiose claims about how we have to fight Putin and fight Russia. What the fuck are you doing? You're sitting at home. Yeah. You're on your phone. And they're not connected to the horrors of war at all. They're completely safe. So it's very easy for them to clamor for more bloodshed. That's largely been a Democratic push. We saw that in the reactions to the letter. a lot of these resistance or Hillary types were browbeating progressives over it. And the right has pretended to be anti-war and anti-intervention. The consequence of progressives and the Democratic Party, which should be an anti-war party, we want that. We want the entire party to be an anti-war party. The consequences of ceding ground to the right, what does that look like to you over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so unnecessary, and we are, my organization, Just Foreign Policy, we are nonpartisan and also kind of do work with the left and the right, usually in, there are some good faith right-wing folks that oppose war and just want the, U.S. to stay out of other places. And, so I just don't, I think it's just such an unnecessary self-own, but I think this is kind of the fight for the battle of the Democratic Party. And you do have folks that when push comes to shove, they would rather the Democrats lose than, sacrifice the U.S. position, in the rules-based international order, and I think so there is that fight. And I think everyone, the people who watch your show, progressives who are really, I think people of kind of millennial or Gen Z or whatever the next one, we're going to have to fight to kind of say, no, we really don't care about global domination and maintaining that. If we can't even, fix the stuff here, there's just no justification for I think it's just so obvious to even conservatives, if they're not even progressive, they say, well, I don't like something here. Why are we spending money there? I could use it for anything. So I think it's just such a guaranteed winner. And I think we're going to have to fight some of these deep state, kind of these more DC, NatSec progressive types, so-called progressives, or who are really, by global standards, they're pretty far right by global standards. They're one of the more right-wing parties, those folks. And, and then kind of the base of the Bernie movement. So I think we can win it, but it's not guaranteed. And certainly we've been on the back foot.
We talk about ceding ground to the right. I think it's one of the reasons, again, I've been advocating that there needs to be more room to talk about dialogue and diplomacy, and also talk about the role that America and Canada and the NATO country played in provoking this conflict in the first place, which, as we pointed out many times as a caveat, is not an excuse or justification for any horrible things that have happened in the war. But it's just a fact that we have contributed to it, that we contributed to that situation, pushing up against this red line of Russia's, as many not socialist, anti-imperialist, but establishment national security types have been warning for years. Russia's going to consider this a provocation if we keep on pumping arms into this region and funding this kind of civil war that's been going on. And that's one of the reasons I've been advocating for that there needs to be space to have these discussions, because when I think people in the kind of progressive left or when the mainstream Democratic Party abdicate that responsibility, it opens the door for not only people like Tucker Carlson, but also these LaRoucheite weird cultists that we saw at this anti-war rally that happened in DC over the weekend, which was quite an interesting scene. But that's been the tricky thing, I think, parsing some of these things, because I think when I listen to some of these folks talk about this, oftentimes when they talk about Russia or also China in some cases, they'll say things that I think are based in kind of a real analysis and understanding of how these incidents have played out. But then they're, of course, leading people, using these kind of truthful elements and leading people down this path of reactionary thought and, embracing the kind of anti-vax crowd or the contributing to the trans panic or appealing to these Donald Trump loving January 6th insurrectionists and stuff. And I think it's a kind of dangerous and insidious thing when these folks are able to use this kind of rhetoric around foreign policy and then pull people into that camp and away from the kind of what the anti-war movement should be, which is a broad and inclusive and progressive movement. And it allows them to come in here and kind of wreck that movement.
Yeah, these clips of these LaRouche folks harassing the squad members are just, it's unbearable to watch. It's you're just there's no attempt to be persuasive or to try to engage and understand that it's just a very backwards view about why it is that people aren't taking more progressive positions. Well, we know why they're not taking more progressive positions. It's a very hard right-wing country, and there's a lot of political costs to doing so. And so we need to create the space and encourage them and figure out, how to encourage our progressive members. Because you talk to any of these squad members privately, what someone believes does not mean that they can just go take any political position you want in the U.S. political system. It's a tough political climate, as we saw with the letter. So it's really frustrating to see these LaRouche folks who are screaming at the squad members. And what you can tell is that they're not coming at it from a place of compassion where we are, worried about the harm to humans that these policies are causing, and that we want to figure out how can we reduce that harm. These are people, it's like a hobby, some weird hobby or some weird thing that they, define themselves with and that they use to say that they're better than others. But you can tell it's not coming from a place of like genuine concern and, for the victims of this conflict,
Yeah. To Rob's point, when I saw some of these clips from the event, because I'm curious and I want to observe whenever there is an anti-war effort in DC, it's frustrating and disappointing when I see speakers who are even purportedly self-described, on the left, getting up there and using their time to rail against vaccine mandates, rail against trans people, gender identity, the culture war issues. How does that fit into our foreign policy? Who cares? Why do you care, for one? Why do you care how someone else identifies? And why, when you have an audience and you can talk about foreign policy, why do you put that on the same level? And it's really bizarre how, people on the left are using these right-wing points to gain an audience. And then also the right is using this anti-intervention, anti-war platform, stance, position, talking points to make inroads, which ultimately for them on the right, it still leads to nationalism because it's just an isolationist policy. And that's also extremely dangerous, even if you're framing it in this anti-war rhetoric. It's still really dangerous because at the end of the day, they're still going to blame immigrants, marginalized communities, people of color, whoever. They're going to blame them for the problems that working class people face in this country. Once you get past, if they are successful, reducing military funding, guess who's next on the chopping block? So it's frustrating. But the thing is, those get attendance even by some well-meaning people on the left because there isn't anything else on the left. There isn't a physical action in DC. There isn't a huge groundswell of support for an anti-war push on this front. So what do they have? That's the only option they have right now. It's really, really heartbreaking to watch.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think I will say on the upside, what we have seen, I forget, if folks might, remember from our childhood, the good old fashioned, Iraq war, where we sent in almost 20 years, a month from now, it'll be 20 years or whatever. But we sent in the troops, and 5,000 troops died, and little by little, they've been kind of distancing the U.S. from the war. So on one hand, that it's good in the sense that it protects our troops from being killed and injured and from then later having the suicide issues and stuff that are just horrifying. But it also, creates a new challenge. And, because they just have, like in Yemen, the Saudi princes are doing the bombing runs. And in Ukraine, just all Ukrainian bodies and U.S. weapons, Ukrainian bodies, and so I will say that, on one hand, I think that's partially responsible for why it's a little harder to get people to turn out. And it's because we're chipping away. The war machine can't just send in bodies like they used to be able to. And that's because of the work of a lot of people. I know a lot of people I grew up with, in middle school, high school those days, like high school, I guess it was. We're chipping away, but they do find new ways. And now they got a war on Russia's border, and they're kicking Russia's butt. And Russia is thinking about going nuclear. So, I mean, I'm hoping that this will be, if we can get through this one, I think we'll be in good shape to kind of call out this type of new kind of proxy war where you can have endless Ukrainian bodies. In fact, the more Ukrainians die, the more you can rally support. So it's this really twisted thing. And hopefully, once we defeat this kind of new manifestation, we'll hopefully be in a good place. But we'll see.
You mentioned the invasion of Iraq. I mean, that is one thing there, like on the anniversary of the 20-year anniversary of the Iraq invasion. I know there is an answer-led anti-war protest going on in DC, which I'm kind of interested to see how that compares to the one that we just saw over the weekend, this kind of libertarian LaRoucheite thing. I guess, but when you talk about the invasion of Iraq and just the way that like America has engaged with the rest of the world throughout the last several decades, or even throughout the last 20 years or so, and what our allies do as well, I think that's what I've found very gross and hypocritical throughout the last year of the kind of talking about Russia and suggesting that they're the only country that has ever engaged in an invasion of another country, or they're just inherently brutal and violent in something in the Russian DNA, or this kind of the way that we've kind of taken this holier than thou approach to talking about this, while completely ignoring our own role, not even in just provoking this conflict, but the last 20 years of the war on terror, the absolute horror that we, America and its allies unleashed on the world there, and the way our allies are acting right now, like what Israel is doing right now at this very moment in the West Bank. And we totally turn a blind eye to that. We talk about how important it is for Ukrainians to have the right of self-defense. And we're showing video tutorials on how to make a Molotov cocktail, but we don't extend the same opportunity to Palestinians. We don't extend the same opportunity to Yemenis, who are also under this brutal campaign, one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world that we're subsidizing and funding. So again, it doesn't. I don't want to let Russia off the hook for engaging in any terrible things throughout the last year, but I've found the hypocrisy really hard to stomach. The way that people in the United States and Canada also played a very large role in encouraging this conflict in the first place, have been taking this kind of like high and mighty attitude that we're the defenders of democracy and human rights and freedom and all that stuff. I mean, it's just childish, and it's been disappointing and frustrating, I think, to see people engaging in that kind of rhetoric and seeing that there's still apparently a big audience for it that believes that.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. I mean, I can't tell how many people are even tuned in. Certainly in our educated class, people are pretty tuned in to MSNBC and CNN and all that. But, I think a lot of people see through it. And the real issue, too, is that it just came out in the Post. It was a new piece in the Post basically showing that the only countries that are giving weapons and engaged in sanctions on Russia for this are the U.S., Canada, Europe, and then a few of U.S., South Korea and Japan. But vast majority of the world has not provided arms, have not sanctioned Russia. And a lot of them are, kind of on Russia's side. They feel like it's a dispute between the U.S. and Russia, and the U.S. has been unfair to Russia. I mean, that's a huge percentage of the world. When you look at this Washington Post piece came out, they posted on Twitter today. I saw it last night. But you realize that the only countries that are engaged in this are U.S. and Europe, pretty much. It's really mostly a global north, kind of a white country phenomenon. And I think most people in the developing world are like, come on, folks, just talk this out. The U.S. So I think that we're on a good track, but. I think a lot of the world is kind of seeing that hypocrisy, and a good percentage of the American people are too. So if we can just get this progressive movement to realize that, we're losing votes this way. I mean, I think hopefully we can make that case, but I'm feeling, I guess, mildly optimistic, but that could change quickly.
I wonder what you make of Zelensky's comments a few days ago regarding China potentially getting involved, or China allegedly backing Russia in this conflict. And he said, if China does ally with Russia in this, supply Russia with aid, arms, back them, whatever, there will be World War III. That's not exactly peaceful rhetoric. But as you just laid out, Ukraine has the backing from most, if not all, of Europe, the United States, Canada, few other countries elsewhere in the Pacific. Why, if one country backs Russia, would that lead to World War III? What do you make of his comments, and why should we be alarmed by that potential?
I mean, I think that, the reality is the Ukrainians are seeing that, they recently passed a law cracking down on deserters and people in bad behavior in the Ukrainian army ranks. It was really controversial. Like 30,000 Ukrainians signed a petition to Zelensky asking not to do it. Is so harsh. So it shows that, there's concerns about the troop morale, and essentially I think they're just horrified that if, China were to come in now, give Russia some additional support, Russia might start rolling, because as of now, it's pretty it's pretty evenly matched, and this thing is on its way to stalemate. And so I think, I think Ukraine is worried that, they have it pretty much stalemated. And if China gets involved, they could be in really big trouble. And so for that reason, China is not going to get, in my opinion, they won't get very involved. They might provide some minor dual use stuff, but they're not going to be arming in any major way Russia. I think I'm not too worried about that, but it is heartbreaking for the Ukrainians who got, encouraged to fight rather than talk it out. There was a lot of voices in DC said, do not talk it out. Don't even consider it. And it's heartbreaking, reading the stories of how many people lost their lives, and ultimately the negotiated settlement is going to be something very similar to what they could have got without all the death and destruction before the war.
Well, even you look at the Minsk agreements, and I know like one of the reasons that Zelensky was so popular when he was initially elected was because he was campaigning on following the Minsk agreements and having some kind of dialogue and dialing down the violence. So I know there's a lot of appetite for that. But that's the thing. It's like there was those comments from Angela Merkel a couple weeks ago as well, where she kind of talked about that and kind of openly said that, oh yeah, the West never really had every intention of getting Ukraine to follow those agreements. That was just buying time so we could continue to pump arms into the country and train them and get them ready for this. So it's like, yeah, it is heartbreaking because there was many off ramps prior to this conflict breaking out that just seemed to be ignored at every turn. And yeah, I guess just on the subject of China, like we were just talking about, yeah, like I agree. It's like they've been pretty consistent about wanting to de-escalate the conflict and not make it even worse. So I don't really see why that would change. But like I definitely appreciate your optimism about the possibility of this winding down. But it does also seem like there's appetite. I don't know if maybe it's a small minority of these extreme hawks that populate Washington, D.C. that want to turn Taiwan into the next kind of flashpoint, the next proxy war. And they're pumping arms into Taiwan as well, just as they were doing in Ukraine prior to the conflict breaking out. And there seems to be a lot of appetite for some people in Washington to have that kick off even more spectacularly over the next couple of years. So are you optimistic that we're going to be able to avoid that outcome? Because that seems to be, regardless of what Zelensky was saying about China backing Russia, that does seem like the potential to spiral into an even worse global conflict if they are able to kind of ignite that to the same extent in Taiwan.
Yeah, that would be absolute, economic nightmare. I mean, we've had some supply chain issues, my mom's been, complaining the delays and things shipping. I said, Mom, this is all the global supply chain. It's this, I'm working on this. I'm trying to get the supply chain going. But in all seriousness, that would be, China is like the world's, factory. The trade would be insane. And so, that is where, I want to be hopeful. I think it's a thing where we all have to be engaged for sure. It's not just a small group of extreme hawks here. It is the prevailing view in Washington, I would say, even among Democrats and senators and, who are maybe even center left on other issues. And they're aligned with Lindsey Graham saying, no, send them the planes. It's like, you are going to get Ukraine nuked. Okay. What are you doing? But I don't know. There's something, but I do think the good news is we do have, Biden, who he's appeared to, for example, in the Libya war, he was on the side saying stay out. He was pretty consistently at different times concerned about the Afghanistan war. He did ultimately get us out. He did learn a little bit from that same Obama kind of anti-war trend. And so he's sort of part of that. And I think that is one of the only things we have going for us, honestly, is good old, Uncle Joe and his very elder state. One of the things he remembers is, I don't want to be the guy who gets the world nuked. So I think that's one of the only things we have going for us. But on the Taiwan question, I think, I'm hoping that we people will have learned. And I think there's some evidence of that. Like we just had a vote to create the new China committee, a new committee in Congress. The House voted. And it was basically a referendum on, do you want to do a Cold War with China or not? And we got 65 Democrats to vote no, don't create the committee. Which was kind of like pretty impressive. It beat expectations. And so I do think people are like, okay, Ukraine, you got us. Yeah, support Ukraine, fund Ukraine with weapons and give them weapons. But I think there's going to be more reluctance to go down that path with Taiwan among many progressives. I think there's some indications that people are like, good old George W. Bush, like, fool me once, whatever, you can't fool me again. That's our hope with these progressives. They're saying, all right, we're not going to go down this escalation spiral with Taiwan now in the same way that we did with Ukraine.
Yeah, I guess it just gets kind of scary. You saw the absolutely unhinged freak out over the Chinese spy balloon and that over the last couple of weeks, and the way that the media just seems to be like completely chomping at the bit to inflame this as much as possible and to make people as fearful as possible that China is coming to spy on them in the shower or whatever it is they think is going on, So it's very strange. I mean, you got to hope that reason is going to prevail there. As you pointed out, there's deep economic ties between China and the US and China and the whole rest of the world. And starting this kind of like hot war with them would be absolutely cataclysmic. But, still there seems to be a large appetite for that. So I hope that you're right, that the sensible people are going to prevail in that argument and not give in to the people that are just seemed adamant to push us all towards this global conflict, which is going to be a massive cataclysm for everybody.
Yeah, and they got new agreement on Philippines now. They're working with the former dictator's family. We're not concerned about that. We're now setting up military bases, patrols with the Philippines. It's all surrounding China. So they're going to have many opportunities to stir up a war. And we'll just have to keep, doing the work of teaching people, like, how much it's gonna mess up their lives and provide nothing of value to do it. But it's gonna be the fight that will probably define many of our next decade or two of our lives here.
On the near term, though, and somewhat related, it was reported a week or so ago that the Biden administration is expected to request the biggest Pentagon budget ever. Around the same time, as Rob was pointing out, there was this hysteria over the balloons, many of which were ultimately determined to be like hobbyists, just flying, high altitude balloons for whatever hobby they're into, weather, science, non-gaming bullshit. So I don't care. But Hawks used that as an opportunity to call for even more military funding. We need to do this. China's going to keep sending these devices. Last summer, it was reported we've been doing the same thing. That was the next frontier for our war, or ultimately our Cold War right now with China. We have these devices and we're doing the same thing. The Atlantic did a glowing piece about high altitude devices and how it's the next thing for the American military. So in the near term, we're expected to see the biggest Pentagon budget request ever, and likely Congress will punch it up even more. What should people understand about that as we get closer and closer to a $1 trillion annual military budget?
Yeah, I think it's just, the challenge we have is the people who need support in their communities most are just not looped into the Pentagon funding, authorization and appropriation process, right? This is not something that, the average American couldn't tell if there's a 7 or a 5 in front of all those zeros or whatever. And that's our real challenge in kind of getting people engaged, getting them following it, and showing a real trade-off. And so we will be, I think working on this year to try to see if we can get this Pentagon spending fight to actually be heard by working people in the country, not just this kind of this DC political class, but get people to be able to see, like, really visualize what we could have as a society if we just went back to President Obama's defense budget. And I think that's you say, did you feel good under President Obama? We did. In fact, it was, people felt pretty safe at the end of President Obama's term. And so, but we could have it's unimaginable what we could have for it would be, about $300 billion worth of spending money that we could spend on real national security priorities, like our schools, right? I think we all have educator, family, or friends. After the pandemic, these schools are in pretty rough shape. These kids are struggling, and many of these kids are struggling. So I think it's an important national security priority to get these kids to be in a healthy place so that they can actually produce and have fulfilling lives, but that's of course not, the national security type thing that, that's most of interest here in Washington.
Yeah. What's the amazing thing about the defense budget as well, the Pentagon budget, is you'd think, you gave Biden credit for committing to that timeline in Afghanistan and ending that war. You'd think ending that massive 20-year war, that would actually decrease the budget, but somehow the thing just keeps going up. It's funny how that works. I don't get it.
Yeah, it's kind of like the best, we end the Afghanistan war. Well, now we get great power competition. We end the Ukraine war. Well, now we get a Taiwan war. So it's, but at some point they got to run out of wars. So if we just keep chipping it away, I think we're getting down to the final wars. And so we're either going to win and we'll have some kind of peace, or obviously we'll go up in, you guys are in DC, right? Or, I'm in DC, so, it'll be the end. But I think we're going to win. But I think the spending is just, it's just amazing to think how these people are making off with all this money, all these crazy missile systems. It's like, all this incredible technology. It's like, dude, you could just talk it out. You could just like find a mutually agreeable kind of way of getting along in the world. And, but that's just so far beyond what they think is possible. Everyone else is the evil one. We have the best intentions, everyone else is evil, and it's like, well, it's just amazing that they can really believe that,
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, that kind of attitude about talking it out, that's not good for the Raytheon shareholders though. So going to be a no, unfortunately.
Yeah. Who really please center the most marginalized group in America, Eric. When you talk about this kind of stuff, we really need to keep them front and center. Yeah. Their dividends.
Yeah, well, they are doing pretty well. There are a lot of, good people working as lobbyists here in DC. A lot of them have, really, they really are some lobbyists that picked themselves up by their bootstraps, became great lobbyists. But unfortunately, what they're representing is basically evil. But,
yeah,
it's whatever.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people follow you and learn more about Just Foreign Policy? Yeah, I think probably the best way would be our Twitter at JustFP, handle it at JustFP. And my personal Twitter is Erik Sperling on Twitter as well, and also justforeignpolicy.org. But yeah, we'd love to, join our list and and if you're in the DC area or if you're really anywhere, we'd love to have you kind of connect and help get involved with our efforts to, essentially just try to fight this horrible war machine and all its varying parts. All the progressive war machine aspect. You wouldn't believe how many people are, progressive in DC, but then are actually serving those same interests. So we need everyone we can get. And so hit me up, through Twitter if that's something of interest to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Eric.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening to The Insurgents. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can find us on iTunes or Spotify or at Substack, theinsurgents.substack.com. You'll get the latest episodes delivered straight to your inbox, as well as our newsletter. On Twitter, we are at InsurgentsPod. Tweet at us, harass Ken in our replies, and then send us your hate mail to theinsurgentspod@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening.